great. I had two different people ask me, and I think it was two different people, unless it's the same person under different names, about the nature of Lutheran worship. And the question, can we have like a Lutheran theology with a worship that is more evangelical, or a worship service that looks maybe more familiar, not so maybe high church or Roman Catholic looking, as people would say. So I would say that, I mean, I could say buy my book on the subject, because I do have a book, Liturgical Worship, a Lutheran Introduction. So I would say, yeah, that you should read that if you want a more detailed answer. But just to give you the short of it, I think that we can't really fundamentally distinguish between the theology that we have and the way that we worship. And it has, I think, been a mistake, largely in the 20th century, of a lot of traditions trying to grab onto different modes of worship and say we can apply our theology, but we can apply our theology in a way that maybe mimics the music of popular culture, say, or the clothing of popular culture, or whatever it might be. And so we can keep the theology orthodox, but we can change the practice. Now, I think there are a number of problems with this. One is simply that the church has always recognized the connection between theology and practice. There's a famous phrase from St. Prosper of Aquitaine, who said, lex orandi, lex credendi. So the law of worship is the law of believing, or the rule of worship, the rule of believing. In other words, there's this interconnected relationship between what it is that we believe and then how we confess that and how we worship. These are, intimately tied together with one another. So any notion that says that we can kind of separate those two things, I think, is mistaken, largely because we are not just, we have to recognize that we are not created to have minds that are separate from our bodies. Like, worship includes mind and body. We are body and soul, or body and spirit. And because we are those two things, our intellect and our physical bodies are so intimately tied with one another. So I think the idea that there's this kind of disconnect from the mind, maybe in a Cartesian sense or something, from the mechanics of the body or the physical body, is mistaken. And if you think you kind of believe one thing, but that doesn't have an impact on how you worship, what you do with your body or how you sing or any of those things can be totally different while all still thinking or believing the same things. I think it depends upon a fundamentally misunderstood relationship between the soul and the body, or the mind and the body. So, I think that it's hard to do that. Now, with all of that being said, and there is some flexibility, right? It's not. This is actually the next part of the Augsburg Confession series that I'm going to be doing. I'll be talking about exactly this. So if you want to watch that when that comes out, which will be pretty soon, within the next few weeks, I think I'll be going back to that. But I'll be dealing with the question of religious ceremonies and those kind of things. So there is some flexibility. It's not everyone has to do things in exactly this way all the time. And there can be no flexibility in terms of how you sing or what you say or anything like that. But there is how you worship is fundamentally confessing something about what you believe. And so if you examine what goes on in a worship service, say between a Lutheran divine service or a more charismatic service, the order of service is going to be different. The songs are going to be different. And some of that is culture and tradition, sure. But a lot of that is because the theology drives what you do in a service. So if the purpose of your worship service is largely a kind of emotional encounter with God in some way, then you're going to have a long time of worship music, and that particular worship music is going to stir your emotions in a particular way, because that's the focus of the service. That's what you believe worship is about. If you believe that worship is essentially about God coming to us, not about my experience of God. Of course, there's an experience in worship, so experience isn't bad, but it's about God coming to us, and then us responding to God's coming to us with praise and thanksgiving, which is essentially the Lutheran order of service. God speaks, we respond. God speaks, we respond. If you're coming for that approach, then your service is going to look different. So again, I would say that there is flexibility there. For example, I've preached quite a few times at a Liberian LCMS church in Syracuse, and they have African music. It's very different from the kind of German hymns that I'm used to singing. But that music is used within that same regular structure of the divine service. So there's some flexibility, like the musical styles and instruments, of course, is very different because it's a different culture. But at the same time, it's not it's still a very Lutheran service because we're essentially following the regular order of service of God speaking to us and us responding in praise. The way that we respond in praise may be a little different, but it doesn't mean that the theology is different. So there's some flexibility there culturally and other things. But it's still, we have to be cautious of what our confession is as we're changing things or as you're doing things in certain ways. So, okay, hopefully that answers the question. A while ago, and this is before I wrote the book. I think while I was writing the book on liturgical worship, I did a podcast series going through aspects of the liturgy, aspects of the service, and I never finished that. Maybe it's something I should kind of revisit now that it's been years now. So maybe I should revisit that at some point and kind of go through the liturgical service and explain point by point. And now that I do things through YouTube and not just podcasts, I could actually like show aspects of the service and kind of break it down. Maybe that's something I can do in the future.